It's okay to start.
Hey, good morning again. This is Sylvia Barak Fishman. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this session of Historical Tropes in Contemporary Anti-Semitism. This is a seminar that brings out the perennial patterns in the phenomenon of anti-Semitism to shed light as to why exactly this is the longest hatred. The aim of the series is to elucidate millennial themes and the variations on those themes, and to bring out the essence of anti-Semitism, to explain why the phenomenon is at once ancient and modern, and to impart a deeper understanding of how what was once the scandal of anti-Semitism has morphed into fashionable anti-Semitism. We want to enable participants in the seminar to recognize this phenomenon in all of its subtle manifestations and to seek ways of responding to it. I'm so delighted to introduce this morning's speaker, Professor Richard Landis, who was trained as a medievalist at Princeton University. His work has focused on apocalyptic beliefs and millennial movements. He developed the concept of demotic religiosity, an orientation that prizes equality before the law, the dignity of manual labor, and access to sacred texts for all believers, and the moral integrity over social honor. In 2015, Professor Landis retired from Boston University, where he was a professor in the history department. He currently lives with his wife in Jerusalem, where he says he can write free of politically correct pressures. In 2022, Professor Landis will have his book published by Academic Studies Press, All's Unquiet on the Western Front, Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism, and the Global Caliphate in the 21st Century. Today, Professor Landis will speak to us on the topic, Supersessionism, Moral Schadenfreude, and the Great Satans of the Progressive Left. At the conclusion of Professor Landis's remarks, we'll have a chance to engage him in conversation and Q&A. So as you think of them, please send your questions into the chat line. Professor Landis, please. Unmute yourself, please.
There we go. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm accepting suggestions on the title. And although, as a clue to what I'm about to talk about, although I couldn't use the word because it would put potential readers off, it actually should read Lethal Journalism, Supersessionism, and the Global Caliphate in the 21st Century. And that's the topic of my talk. And let me introduce it by saying that I first gave this talk in 2016 in Bloomington, Indiana, conference at Alvin Rosenfeld Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And although some people seem to like it, it was rejected not only in the volume that came out from that conference, but in 3 other journals that were dedicated to anti-Semitism. So I can't even use the excuse that a bunch of anti-Semites kept my article from being published, because this was a sympathetic audience, and yet they seem really, at least some of the readers seem quite hostile. And so I welcome any thoughts you might have on, they felt my tone was too polemic, it was too harsh, it wasn't academic enough. I softened the tone, but I guess apparently not enough. I have not softened it for this talk. So the problem that I'm trying to solve could be phrased in the following form. Why are Western progressives so receptive to Palestinian lethal narratives about the Israelis behaving like the Nazis. And the first time that we really see it loud and clear is with the story of Muhammad Adura, which I've spoken and written about extensively, a boy caught behind a barrel in an exchange of fire between Israelis and Palestinians at Netzarim Junction right at the beginning of the Intifada. And the footage was presented as the Israelis gunned this kid down in his father's arms in cold blood, which was what the cameraman argued. So the response to this was that a journalist, a French journalist, actually said that this picture of this boy caught in a crossfire, not clear who killed him. In fact, investigations show the Israelis couldn't have shot him, and even suggest that he wasn't shot, that it was staged. But at the time, people didn't know it. They just went for this story. Catherine Ney, a major and not particularly leftist, but a European journalist, said this picture replaces the picture of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto holding up his hands. So in other words, what we had was somebody leaping on what turned out to be a lethal narrative, not true, but designed to arouse hatred, leaping onto that lethal narrative and saying that that picture erases a picture that symbolizes the deliberate murder of 1 million children. So, you know, for me, that registers as something of well, let's call it moral disorientation on a very high scale. And I would argue that a great deal of the sort of Holocaust inversion that we've seen in this century is due to the success of this particular, what I call the first postmodern blood libel, the first successful blood libel to, and with a worldwide audience, to succeed since the Holocaust. Okay, so the second one was Jenin, where the Palestinians told stories about the Israelis shooting people. I mean, they must have been reading Robert Browning's Ordinary Men, the description of the German police shooting Jews in Poland in 1941. You're just lining them up, shooting them at point blank range, and filling the mass grave up afterwards. And that's what they were saying the Israelis were doing, and that's what the media believed, and that's what the media presented to the world. And at the height of it, you have Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, saying that, can the whole world be wrong about this? The Israelis were saying they haven't done any of this stuff. Turns out they hadn't. It turns out 56 people were killed on the Palestinian side in 3 weeks of urban warfare, which is something of a record, and over 40 of them were combatants. So it was exactly the opposite. And the Israelis are saying, that's not what we're doing. And he's basically saying, and literally he didn't know it, but he was echoing the words of Echad Ha'am, describing what happens in the 1890s when you try and tell the Gentiles that Jews don't use the blood of Christians for their matzah. Their answer was, can the whole world be wrong and the Jews be right? So here in 2002, we have 120 years later, we have a replication of this pattern of thinking in which the blood libel against the Jews is vastly more believable than the, shall we say, the Jewish insistence that they're not guilty of it. And these two events were so strong in the mentality of the time that in 2003, unknowns to each other, both writing more or less independently, on the one hand, we have Paul Berman writing about liberalism and terrorism and saying the reaction to the suicide bombing against the Israelis is taken by outsiders as proof of Israeli guilt. They wouldn't be doing this if the Israelis hadn't been so mean to them. And that's embodied in an expression I heard from a colleague for the first time, and it just floored me, but then I heard it a lot, was, what choice do they have? So basically you're saying what the Israelis are doing must be so awful that they have no choice but to do this. And at the same time as Paul Berman is noting this insane inversion in which the people who are committing really horrendous crimes are being justified, and the people, their victims, are literally being described as the embodiment of such evil that they deserve it. Just at this time, Ian Buruma, writing in the New York Times, in a sort of what's it called? It wasn't the point of his sentence. It was just in a sort of clause on the side in which he says that, because it's so obvious, that support for the Palestinian cause had become the litmus test of being a liberal. In other words, just as the Palestinians are behaving atrociously, this particular alchemy has made it possible for people to side with them. Okay, I saw that. All right. Now, I'll skip over the rest of it. My book is about these early years, but I try and fill in the rest, briefly sketch it in the second part. You can fill it in. You've probably experienced, you've surely all experienced some element of this, all the way to May 2021, when you have literally whole departments and in academia signing anti-intellectual rants against the Jews as a kind of, what's the word I can use? As their virtue signaling of their commitment to social justice. And I don't question these people's sincerity, I question their intelligence, but not their sincerity. Well, if they want me to take their intelligence seriously, then I question their sincerity. But whatever, I mean, it's just an astonishing sight to see these letters come out, including from Jewish scholars. Okay, so in trying to figure out, and this really starts in 2000. I mean, what I'm talking to you about are thoughts that have developed with me since the year 2000, when this stuff really hit the fan. One of the things that was clear to me was there was a direct link between lethal journalism, which I define as reporting one side's war propaganda as news. Normally it's patriotic. You report your own side's war propaganda as news. Professional journalism is supposed to be above that. It's not supposed to, filter that stuff out. When you go to another place and you're observing a fight between two different people, then you might end up, running one side. You favor one side, you run their war propaganda as news. But in principle, that should be filtered out. But we have, since 2000, a whole school of lethal journalists who report Palestinian claims as if true. And when they're disproven, and they report Israeli denials as propaganda, and when it turns out the Israelis are right, they either don't correct or quietly correct and go on to the next lethal narrative. Okay, so you have lethal narratives, and there was clearly a link between these and the outbreaks of anti-Semitism in the West. Initially, the first group to be hit by these lethal narratives and inspired to hatred were Muslims, both the Arabs in Israel, where there was rioting after the story of Adura, but also and obviously amongst our enemies in various territories and places, but also amongst Muslims in Europe. So the French literally count the steady and strong rise of attacks on Jews to literally October 1st, 2000, which is the day after the story of Adura ran on TV. So, but that, now it's become something that's spread. And it's spread not just to crazy people on the left, but crazy people on the right, and to groups that we're not sure where they are. So there's something going on here, and it's extremely strong amongst progressive groups on campus. BDS, Apartheid Week, which was the sort of preliminary for BDS today. And the MESA, Middle East Studies Association, just voted one of these crazy, lopsided, intellectually dishonest denunciations of Israel and supports of BDS. So today, in established progressive circles like Black Lives Matter, it is understood that Israel kills children, that they're guilty of genocidal ethnic cleansing. It's in the platform of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has in their platform a statement on genocidal, on the Israelis committing genocide against the Palestinians. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff, but what that creates is this ridiculous take on reality in which we Jews, this is in the minds of people who are judging it along these lines, we Jews are guilty of genocide. We are the new Nazis, while our self-declared enemies who admire the Nazis openly in Arabic and openly say in Arabic, their leaders, their preachers, that they want to finish Hitler's job, are the new Jews, are victims. Now, for me, that's a form of moral insanity, and I'm trying to figure out how it happened. And obviously, Katrine's thing about how the picture of the Israelis deliberately killing a poor Palestinian boy wiped away the moral debt that the Europeans owe the Jews. So there were three clues that I found as I explored this. One was, and I've already mentioned it, what choice do they have? And this was the response to suicide bombing. Came to the office one day. My colleague, good friend, we always had really interesting conversations, as you look terrible. I said, well, these suicide bombings, there have been 3 that week. And he said, yeah, what choice do they have? Okay. And I said, have you ever heard of Camp David? And he said, oh, yeah, that's a point. And I don't even think he came up with that. I think he heard other people say it. And other people, when that was said, nod their head. And you get it. You get the echoes of it repeatedly. Sherry Blair, Jenny Tonga in the British House of Lords, saying, if I had to suffer what the Israelis are inflicting on the Palestinians, I too might become. Okay. The second thing was the chorus of people I heard saying, Israel's lost the moral high ground. So you get people, and this is not only, for instance, at Jenin, literally what Turge Roed Larson, who was one of the big players in the Oslo process, said. But I had a good friend, really smart guy, wrote excellent books in psychology and stuff, who we were at a conference that met every year. And for 2 or 3 years, he would say the same thing. This time, Israel's lost the moral high ground. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on, because how do you lose the moral high ground to people who teach their children to hate you so that their kids will blow themselves up just so they can kill some of you? You can't lose the moral high ground to them. So what are they talking about? And then I realized the moral high ground we were losing was not to the Palestinians. It was to the liberals, to the progressives, to the good people, to the There's a nice expression in Hebrew, adine nefesh, the sort of fine souls, right? The cosmopolitans, the good people. And we all, at some point in our lives, aspire to that. So we had lost the moral high ground to that. And then the third tip that I got was what I eventually ended up calling the moral Schadenfreude of the consumers of lethal journalism. In other words, Schadenfreude is the pleasure you take in other people's suffering or failure. In this case, it's the pleasure that non-Jews take in the moral failures of the Jews. And that's what pointed me to supersessionism, which is the theme of this series, which is a millennial old set of beliefs that started with Christianity and replicated quite strikingly in Islam, and then shows up in various interesting ways in secular forms, first in the Enlightenment, second in the revolutionary thought of the 19th century, Marx and his followers, and lastly, I think in the 21st century, well prepared before, but, sort of a dominant voice in the 21st century amongst progressives. So what's supersessionism? How much time do I have? All right, I can't hear you, but that's okay. 9 minutes? Oh, all right. So what supersessionism? The key notion in supersessionism is a zero-sum notion of chosenness, in which, in order for we, the new chosen people, to be chosen, the Jews have to be unchosen. We're not sharing this chosenness with you. We're not asking you to accept us into your club of chosen people because we're committed to the same things. No, we are superior to you. We have surpassed you. And in fact, you are now a hindrance to the new stage of moral development or spiritual development that we represent. So it's a zero-sum competition. In order for us to be chosen, the Jews must be unchosen. So it's a form of triumphalist religiosity, which is a religiosity that says, unless I am visibly superior to others, I'm insecure and I'm not sure I have the true religion. What reassures me that I follow the true God is that my religion dominates others. It is superior to others. Now, there are lots of people who feel that way about their religion. And I think it would be, as bad to tell them they can't think that as it would be to tell people that they can never lie. It might even be a psychological necessity. The point is here, the operative term is visibly superior. It's got to be evident. So the laws of the dhimma in Islam represent that kind of formal apartheid legal separation in which Jews cannot give testimony in court. They can't bring a Muslim to court. They have no standing before the law. So originally it was religious. Then with the Enlightenment, there was this movement towards accepting Jews and saying, look, the Christians were wrong about the Jews. And therefore we need to meet the Jews. And Rousseau's a really good example of this, in which he says, I will never think that I know what Jews really think until they have their own university. Little did he know that that would be problematic too, but that's an aside. But what he's saying is, every time I hear the Jews speak, they are worried that they're going to get beat up in one way or another, punished for saying what they think. We won't know what they think until they are free. So that's a very nice idea, and I think it's at the core of democracy. Voltaire and Rousseau. Voltaire represented a different side, very much a kind of we are now superior religion, all religion, including the Jews, is inferior, it is superstitious, we are above it, we are enlightened. And he really disliked the Jews, and so did the revolution, many on the revolutionary left, leading to the expression, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. Now let's go to the progressive left, because what do I have, 5 minutes left? What I'm arguing about the progressive left, 7 minutes, good. What I'm arguing about the progressive left, it runs as follows. The progressive left, I call it in my book, the global progressive left, the global progressive movement, whatever. It's, people who are concerned about global warming, who are concerned about human rights the world over, concerned about equality and social justice. Good stuff, good stuff. They believe, or at least I'm not saying all of them, some of them may have some modesty, but a lot of the leaders believe that their movement is at the cutting edge of global morality. So while they're not necessarily religious, they are definitely an expression of a moral vision. And they believe that this moral vision is the future of the planet. And what I'm suggesting is that they have the same supersessionist problem with the Jews that these earlier religions and earlier manifestations of sort of moral grandeur ran into in terms of the Jews. And there you see it, for instance, in 2003, there were anti-war demonstrations all over the world, a couple of million people in London, over 1 million people in Paris, about 10 million people worldwide demonstrated, and it was a real sort of victory for the progressive side. And Jonathan Schell wrote an article for the New York Times, an op-ed piece, in which he said, look, we are the new superpower, right? Russia's gone, but now we, the global community with our moral anti-war voice, is the new superpower that's the counter to the bad, evil hegemon of the United States. All right, so the 3 tells of secular progressive supersessionism are: 1, this appetite for lethal journalism, which is the need it has for moral Schadenfreude. That's the truffles. If you can get Jews killing kids, you've got the tastiest morsel in the arsenal of lethal journalism. That was the Aldura affair. Secondly, they tend, and this is true of all supersessionists, they tend to project their own notions of chosenness onto the Jews. So one of the things they accuse the Jews of doing is, because we're chosen, we're superior, and then we have a right to do whatever we want to the Gentiles. We a kind of religious racism in which we are so superior, we chosen people, that we can do whatever we want. And this comes out again and again, particularly right after some of these episodes of lethal journalism like Jenin. And the third tell so the third point is that you can look for those. Every time there's a wave of lethal journalism, look around and you'll see an expression of this supersessionism. So here is, and this is from a French sociologist, brilliant, I'm told. I can't say I've read his work, but he's, and there are lots of brilliant French sociologists. Wrote after the Jenin massacre, which he bought hook, line, and sinker in 2002. It's hard to believe that a nation of fugitives, born of the most persecuted people in the history of humanity, having experienced the worst humiliations and suffered the worst contempt, would be capable of transforming themselves in 2 generations into a people sure of itself and domineering, which is a quote from Charles de Gaulle in 1967 when we defended ourselves. With the exception of an admirable minority, namely me, into a people who despise and take satisfaction in humiliating. The IDF has committed acts of pillage, gratuitous destruction, homicide, executions, where the chosen people acted like the master race. Now, he was sued for anti-Semitism for this, and in fact, he lost, which was unusual because French courts weren't too sympathetic to that stuff. But that gives you an idea of even a Jew doing this. Okay, I'm going to read you one other. I'm going to skip Justine Garter. It's too bad, but this elegy, here we have literally what this Gentile thinks Jews think. And it's an elegy for Gaza written after in 2014. We willed the killing. This is he is speaking in the voice of the Jew. So the we is the Jew. We willed the killing to continue and continue and continue. How could we not? We must, no, cannot, will not consider not the sacredness of life, the other, the weak, the children. No, we revel in our treasure, spun of stolen land, a God created in our image, draping our souls with hate and fear enough to warm our hubris. All we stand tall. All, we are the chosen unto the planets. We need no other, want no other, will have no other, suffer no other. No, for we are. Okay, so, and I have other stuff like this. And so you got, what's going on here and why? How do you get this combination of lethal journalism, moral Schadenfreude, and these outbursts of hatred for the Jews in which the notion of chosenness that they have is projected onto them? In this case, you could literally turn that text into a text about Islamic jihadis, and it would be a perfect description of their mindset. All right. So let me finish with the following remark, which is a thought I have that just came to me recently. Again, via paying attention to projections. I'm going over the proofs of my book, and I have a section on the, what's it called? The cartoon scandal, the Danish cartoon scandal of 2005, 2006. And there's a book about it written by a woman named Clausen, who teaches at Brandeis. She's a sociologist. And she basically, at a number of points, refers to people who are alarmist about a danger coming from Islam as engaging in what she calls a moral panic. And, personally, I think there's a lot to worry about in Islam. And I think that anybody who doesn't worry about Islam is, not really, well, in trouble, let's say, in trouble. Okay, so, but what I thought was maybe the real moral panic is with the liberals who got stampeded into supporting the Palestinians over the course of the period from 2000 to 2003. That in the year 2000, there was a kind of moral panic. And the moral panic consisted of the following question: how does a well-meaning, earnest, peace-loving, post-testosteronic, vulnerable, open, highly self-aware and self-critical, cosmopolitan, inclusive, egalitarian, justice-pursuing, lover of the other, and all the hybrid diversity that love brings, who believes that war is not the answer, that violence never solved anything, that humans are naturally peaceful, that prejudice and racism are terrible, and that if we are only kind and understanding to those hostile to us, we can win them over to voluntary, non-coercive, positive-sum relations in which everyone wins. How does somebody with those values respond to the declaration of war on him and his people by a self-declared enemy who shares none of those values, indeed embodies everything that progressives oppose: misogyny, hatred of the other, slaveholding, aspirations to genocide and world dominion. They respond with a moral panic. If they oppose them, fight them, take them at their word, then they might begin that slippery slope to resemble their hated enemy. And that's where the term Islamophobia comes in. It's basically saying, no, if we dislike Muslims, we're going to end up being racist. And that would be terrible. We couldn't do that. We must not do that. Instead, they preferred denial, even acceptance of their enemy on the enemy's terms. So in 2006, after the Lebanon affair, I'm very near the end. In 2006, Judith Butler welcomes Hamas and Hezbollah into the global progressive left because, she explained later, they're anti-imperialist. Now, it's really hard to get stupider. They are some of the biggest imperialists on the planet, and their notion of world dominion beggars any kind of control that the West exercises over the rest of the world today. What 2000 taught me was the power of envy in the world. Here were Europeans, and initially it was Europeans, it was the left. The left sort of didn't flower until, maybe the middle of the first decade, what I call the aughts. But here we were, Europeans preening in their moral superiority, berating Israel and the United States, empowering their enemies just so they could pose as morally superior, so they could occupy the moral high ground. And apparently nothing, not even self-preservation, could be worth the loss of that posture. Their moral panic arose from their inability to allow themselves the stain of self-defense. They had to stay pure in order to turn Israel into a pariah, and that was worth the suicidal embrace of a mortal enemy. In April 2002, when the first democracy to resist jihadi suicide terrorists attacked their headquarters in Jenin, progressive infidels, disinformed by their own lethal journalists about Israel massacring Palestinians like Nazis, demonstrated in large angry crowds all over Europe, calling the army resisting suicide terror Nazis, and wearing mock suicide vests to show their solidarity with people who hated them and who would soon use that weapon against them. It's sort of like the last scene in, an early scene in Independence Day, where the flying saucers are over the cities, but nobody knows who they are, and the hippies are dancing on the rooftop welcoming them, and then they get zapped. Except that those people couldn't know what the aliens were thinking, but the people wearing suicide belts knew perfectly well what they were supporting, what they were cheering on. That was the climax of the moral idiocy of global progressives in the early century, an idiocy they faithfully adhere to this day, now weaponized by social media shaming mobs, and which I call in the book Y2K Mind, partly because it is born in the year 2000, and I define as the mindset that responds to a jihadi assault on a democracy by a moral panic in which they blame the democracy. It consecrated a noxious marriage between a sadistic pre-modern apocalyptic movement, the global caliphate, and a masochistic postmodern apocalyptic movement, most recently called woke, which come together around a shared antichrist, the two Satans, the US and Israel. And that noxious marriage comes as a result, I submit, of a supersessionist moral panic, a desperate need to think of oneself as supremely moral, so much so that the loss of the moral high ground, even momentarily, would be an unbearable blow to the narcissistic ego. And Israel is the first sacrificial victim of that grotesque narcissism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for an extremely provocative and interesting talk, which has evoked a tremendous amount of response in the chat room.
Oh,
Wonderful, wonderful comments and questions. You've partially dealt with this, but let me start with a question by Joseph Levin. What do you think in terms of the sincerity of Israel's critics? Do they really believe what they are saying? You've partially answered it with your analysis of the pathological mental state, which they
right.
this.
Right.
But do you have other thoughts or insights about their sincerity or lack of it?
Yeah. So look, obviously, each case is different. But when I was working on the Aldura affair, of course, the key figure in that is not the Palestinian who did a shoddy fake, but the French Jewish Israeli journalist who served in Dovel Tzahal, Charles Anderlin, and was the correspondent for France 2, thought about what he did, because he turned that story into a believable story. And he cut out a scene that completely contradicted it and said, I did it because it was the death rows and people would be upset with kids picking up his elbow and looking around. So what's going on with him? Does he know? Or is he sincere in thinking that this was a justifiable act? Now, you know, my father used to say, sincerity is the cheapest of emotions. It's really easy to insist on your sincerity. And it's very hard to question somebody's sincerity. So I think there are people, you know, really what we're getting at is the difference between self-awareness and sincerity. I mean, it's an aggressive naivete there. You know, I refuse to recognize that I'm behaving like an idiot. Okay. Yeah.
So
And I sincerely believe in what I'm saying. I sincerely believe the Israelis are acting like Nazis and the Palestinians are innocent victims.
So Barbara Mazer had a question about antidotes, and actually I'd like to call on Barbara, if you can unmute yourself to ask your own question, please.
Hi. Okay, so sorry. One of the things that occurs to me is the way that we frame this whole discussion regarding the accusations against Israel. So one of the things, for example, that progressives are very upset about is how in the US, white supremacists don't want any people from south of the border immigrating into our country. So I would say, well, how is that different than Arabs in the 1930s and 40s not wanting Jews of Europe who were under duress, fleeing persecution, emigrating to there? I mean, why is emigration of one group acceptable and emigration of another group not acceptable? Another one, it's very important that you speak about supersessionism. So one of the issues with Zionist settlement in the first part of the last century was that there was a diminution of power that was exclusively Arab now being taken by Jews. So the whole idea of, you know, loss of privilege, feeling like oppression to people. These are the kinds of tropes that I think we should be talking about when we talk to progressives and responding to them, because what they're doing is they're creating, as Richard points out, they're creating this framing of us as oppressors, as Nazis and things like that. And I think we can frame the conflict as in terms of their values. That's what I wanted to say. I'd like your reaction.
Okay, I'm afraid the sound isn't very good. Can I ask you to repeat that there were a series of tropes that you mentioned? Can you repeat them?
Is this a little better, a little louder?
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry. What I was saying is that, for example, progressives were very against white supremacists opposing immigration of people from south of the border into the United States. So how is that opposition different from
Okay,
Arab
so-
opposition to Jewish immigration in the 40s and 30s.
Okay, good.
And
I can,
when
yeah, no, I
That's-
understand. And
That's what I'm
and
saying. I'm saying is that we can reframe things in terms of their values, just as they're trying to frame Zionists as the enemy, as the Nazis. You can reframe Arabs as the equivalent of U.S. white supremacists. That's
Yeah,
that's
see,
the idea that I'm trying to
you
bring
can
out.
you can try that. I wish you luck. By and large, I find that every effort to make the Arabs look bad is considered blaming the victim. In fact, that's what happened when the evidence started to come out that Abdullah was a fake. The first response, and it's a common response today, joined with that's Islamophobic, is to say you're blaming the victim. So once you've claimed that, so one of the issues we have to get at is what is driving people to see Palestinians and the Palestinian national movement, which happens to be probably one of the nastiest ones on the planet in terms of what its aspirations are, what its preachers say, what it does to its own people, much less to anybody that falls into their control. What makes them so attractive to people? The direction I'd go in the question of letting people in, because Palestinians are saying you Israelis have to let the refugees you kicked out back in. And I think that the important thing to say, both about the border and about this, and it gets at the problem with the supersessionist mindset, is that everything has to be, what's the word? Everything's extreme, everything's black and white. So it's, ICE is evil, cops are evil, there should be no borders, everybody has a right to vote in American elections anywhere in the world, just come. And so you get this absurd but glorious openness to the other, in which you embrace everybody who's coming across the border, which in some senses was what Angela Merkel did in 2015 in Germany. And then you paint anybody who says, wait a minute, we need to regulate the flow of these people as a bunch of white racists who refuse to allow anybody across the border. Right. And I think the most important thing for us to do is not to fall into these ridiculous, polarizations of positions. But again, I think that the reason why I think this gets at what I was saying about the sort of narcissistic desire to be morally pure is, if I don't let some people in, I'm not as nice a person as I need to think I am. Something like that.
Okay, thank you. Toni Kamens has had her hand up for quite a while. She has a question about the stunning and frightening lack of historical awareness among liberal American Jews, as well as non-Jews. It's not just them.
Right.
So Toni, please.
First, I just want to say that your argument, which I basically agree with, reminds me a little bit of what John McWhorter says in his new book called Woke Racism.
Well, I like him a lot.
Anyway, so I belong to a number of, Jewish liberal sort of organizations. And it seems that anytime one asserts one's Jewishness in a particular situation of, social justice, you get accused of being a racist. But when other people assert their blackness, Arabness, whatever, they're reclaiming their power. But Jews, you can't. I mean, I did a piece last week for the Times of Israel, and I expected to get lambasted for it, and I did. But essentially, I was saying, we're Jewish. We need to recognize that we're Jewish, and we need to look at things from that perspective. And I got pilloried.
I'll have to read it because it sounds like a not very exceptional argument. We're Jewish. We have to
start. It was about the December dilemma, but anyway.
Right. Okay. So, but the question you raise, and again, this is something I'm trying to understand because it's so bizarre, is why is it that there's this exceptionalism for the Jews? And you know, if I were to plug it into this particular theory, and I don't know if I do that on my own, but I'm answering your question. You know, there are lots of people who think they're chosen: the Japanese, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Persians, the Muslims, the Christians. There are lots of groups who think they're the chosen people. Somehow that doesn't get up people's noses quite the way Jews thinking they're chosen gets up people's noses. And I think that, you know, one of the things is that for a number of these, and I've run across Gentiles who say this to me, when you realize just how capable the Jews are, how smart they are, how they figure things out, how they organize things and stuff, they influence people. If you are worried about the way they behave, then you can get very paranoid. And I think that one of the things that's going on here in this exception for Jews is a sort of unstated position that the Jews are way too powerful and that we're empowering these people who have been, in the expression of the woke, disadvantaged and marginalized. But the Jews are right at the center of everything, so we don't have to do that for them. Now, the problem is they're bringing in people like Angela Merkel, brought in 1 million Muslims, many of whom came from cultures in which they were literally taught that Jews are a demon people. And that's how she's Wiedergutmaching for the Holocaust. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Ellen Cannon would like to offer another way of framing the issue and has a question for you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for doing such an excellent job as moderator, and Richard for this outstanding presentation, and to thank ISGAP for doing just continued excellent work on this issue. I have a suggestion of how can we as individuals respond in ways to this awful situation that Richard has so brilliantly discussed, in ways that can perhaps puncture just a bit in human language. And I'd like to suggest that one, what's at stake is not only the continued attacks on Jews, but the very notion of democracy in general. And there are two situations that exemplify this. One is a brilliant example is found in the Durban Diaries. It's the writings of a young person who was 21 years old. She went to Durban as one of the leaders of the World Jewish Community that works on NGOs to allow them to understand what we are faced with. And they were over 100 young Jews going to Durban. On the first day, they were physically attacked at the conference. They were surrounded. They were verbally abused. They were called every name that Richard, you have described. The second day was even worse in that one of the chairs of the conference got up and said, although this is a conference to fight world racism, we will only deal with two issues: the difficulties in India of racism and the role of Israel attacking the Palestinians' freedom. And they felt absolutely alienated from that moment on. What was the response of them in human behavior is when they got back to Western Europe, they were so intimidated and totally frightened at what happened at the conference that they feared to continue to speak out. It not was the erasure, but it was the total intimidation of their courage. The second example that I would like to look at really stresses the influence on legal decisions. It was the bravery of David Hirsch being attacked for his scholarship on what anti-Semitism responds to, and he was legally charged with anti-Semitic accusations of groups. What is most dangerous in this legal attack is the court adopted verbally, word for word, the opinion of what anti-Semitism was, according to the absence of friends who were accusing David Hirsch. And he is able in his writings to put up the court's decision so that we are able to see this is not a theoretical question. This is also a question that is lining the future of democracy and the challenge of liberal democracy surviving throughout the world. And if we look at procedures and behaviors that result in real time, that I think can make it less of a academic issue for the world to bite on, and see that we do have, by looking at what like Fine and Spencer called the dual faces of universalism. On the one hand, it can promote emancipation, and on the other hand, it can readapt all of the protocols of Zion using universal language. And so, again, how do we frame it is becoming a very important issue, and I believe that we have some work to do on this, but we need Sylvia's leadership on this, and Richard's leadership, and the ISGAP staff, and all of our wonderful people who have joined us today in what proved to be a fantastic presentation. So I want to thank you.
Just one footnote to what you said. In my book, I discussed Durban. That's the marriage of postmodern masochism and pre-modern sadism. And I point out that Muhammad Abdullah, that boy, the blood libel, was the patron saint of Durban. He really set the tone of hysteria, anti-Jewish hysteria.
And for me, when the young people went and complained at what they were feeling, they were told that nothing could be done to assist them. And this further, again, when we look at the behavior that it imposed, they shut down the kids when they got got back, their courage was diminished.
Right. And I think that if you look at social media shaming, there's a very good book by Ronson, John Ronson, So You've Been Shamed. And that was a while ago. That was maybe 10 years ago. It's gotten much worse since. But you'll see the same dynamics, the same sort of mob intimidation of people who feel the force. And unfortunately, when Westerners hook up with caliphators, the force that they're feeling is going to devour them.
Exactly. And at the Durban conference, the Arab Lawyers League was handing out pamphlets that, again, defined us as Nazis, as genocide producers. And again, it was silent.
Yeah, no, there was a T-shirt that said, if Hitler had won, you know,
there wouldn't be a
no
problem.
Palestinians would be being killed, as if.
Right.
But
Thank
yes,
you so much.
So Durban's a really good example. And, you know, everything that we suffer through, both in terms of Durban was the first call for BDS. It wasn't called BDS, but that's where you have the first resolution saying Israel should be turned into a pariah. And the academic boycotts and so on, all of that sort of comes out of Durban. And the other thing that comes out of Durban is, you know, all the NGOs like Ken Roth and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, who do all sorts of good stuff in other places and then literally go crazy when they get to the Middle East.
I'd like to thank so much, Dr. Cannon. I don't want us to leave the topic today without going back to supersessionism, which, you know, was a big in your title. To what extent do you think that this kind of incredible unfairness, which you have described,
it really is unfair.
And you'll see when you have the chat line, which I know is going to be sent to you, you will see how many people agreed with you and feel like you express very much their experience. But if you think about the original supersessionism, isn't it appropriation? Isn't it early Christianity appropriating Judaism?
In the nastiest way.
Appropriating Judaism. So given how unacceptable appropriation is now in
These
liberal
days,
circles,
right.
how is something which is built on appropriation in the first place, this sense of superiority that you described so brilliantly, is that an argument which can be mounted, or is it just doomed to failure?
Right. I mean, look, it's a good argument, but in these matters, logic has sort of fifth place to other passions, and so look, Christianity is an appropriation of Judaism, right down to taking our texts and telling us we don't understand them. Islam is an appropriation of both Judaism and Christianity and telling us that we have falsified our texts because they know better what they actually contain. And in my read, the Enlightenment is a secularization of Jewish values about respect for the other, all that stuff, and the progressive movement. So all of them are taking from us. And then I don't know if you knew, well, I mean, Freud talks about the Oedipal complex, but Harold Bloom talked about the anxiety of influence, the idea that in order to be truly you can't be influenced by anybody. And you're always anxious that somebody's going to discover that you weren't the source of the idea or whatever. And, in that sense, the Muslim insistence on what's the word? The prophet is flawless. He has no flaws. He made no mistakes. And that's why they can say that we, switched the text because it doesn't agree with what Muhammad said. This kind of thinking is a kind of psychological defense. Now, how you communicate past psychological defenses, I would suggest that we need to relook at the whole issue of honor and shame. I think there's a huge amount of an honor-shame dynamic, which is embodied in the expression virtue signaling, because you're signaling to others how they should be looking at you rather than being what you should be or want to be. So I think that we need to look at, certainly in terms of the Arab attitude towards us, we have to look at matters of primary honor shame. And in terms of the left, I think that right now the whole cancel culture is a classic expression of the dynamics of honor shame culture, and they are impermeable to logic. Doesn't mean that we can't figure out ways to deal with it, but trying to convince them out of those patterns of behavior is not going to work.
So on that wonderful call to arms that we have to deal with things, even if we can't convince those people who are implementing these very dangerous and unfair thoughts and policies. I'm going to thank you, Professor Richard Landis, for really an extraordinary presentation. And I also want to thank all of the participants who had very, very thoughtful, intelligent, important comments. Even though it's virtual, it's been a wonderful conversation. So thank you.
Listen, I look forward to reading them, and if they're as good as you say, I might even put them up at my blog. So if anybody said something they don't want to find up at my blog, send me an email, rlandes@bu.edu, rlandis@bu.edu. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.